March 3rd. I've always kind of hated my brother. Well, hate's a strong word. I just always hated how easy everything was for him. He's 2 years older than me, but everything just comes so easily to him. In high school, he was in ROTC, taking courses in criminal justice so he could get a leg up on his law enforcement career. He had a string of friends and girlfriends and made his high school years amazing. He never seemed to study, always retaining what he needed for tests, and finished his high school a half a year early with a nearly perfect GPA. He didn't need to. He could have just joined the police academy right out of high school, but he chose to join the army for 4 years, saying it was his duty to his country. He served as an MP and later as a base investigator for base-related crimes. When he got out, he was practically ready to start police work already. Now he's a hotshot detective, while the only thing I got out of high school was an unfavorable comparison to my perfect older brother and too many bullies to count. But it looks like his streak's coming to an end now, while this new string of murders keeps piling up. They're calling him the West End Cannibal, and his crimes are truly horrific. He meets women online, pretty common in this day and age, and then he murders them in their own homes. He cuts them open, sometimes stealing their organs, and they found bites and burns on them as well. The missing organs lead them to believe that he's eating them, but they don't really seem to have any proof. My brother talks ceaselessly about this guy during our weekly meetups to have a beer and talk about life. This is something he insists on, since it gives him an opportunity to talk about himself. My work is so boring that no one in their right mind would want to hear about it. Very little happens to me that would make anyone want to hear about my life. Probably why I'm still single. The crux of it is, my brother told me last week as he sat on his stool at O'Malley's, is that I don't think the bites belong to him. We found dental records from 3 different sets of teeth, and one of them came back with dental records on a recently deceased person. So what, he grave robs too? I asked, not really interested, but wanting to hear him flounder. The guy's still buried, though. We exhumed his body. His wife was right pissed, and we found his teeth intact. We're chasing our tails here. This guy hasn't given us a lot to work with, and his body count is nearly in the double digits now. I pretended to be speculative, but really I was laughing into my beer at him. My perfect brother, so confident and sure of himself, was being thwarted by some nobody. I had sat on this stool for years, just waiting for a story like this. I know it sounds petty, but I like to see him unsure of himself. It makes me realize that he's just as human as I am. March 12th. There were another 2 murders this week. He called me this time, not having time for a beer as the department scrambled to figure this out. I just don't get it, he said, and his voice sounded tired. This guy's a genuine ghost. We have him picking up his first victim on Tinder, but his second victim was some random woman from a bar. Jesus, but he really did a number on her. He slashed off one of her breasts. We found it in the corner. All of her organs were just strewn about the bathroom. We had kind of thought that maybe he was selling them or something, but now he's not even taking them with him. He's just dismembering them and leaving them sitting around. I pretended to listen, cleaning up so I could get home as I prepared to leave my job, but my face likely looked like a kid on Christmas morning. He was really worried about this. He was really worried that he couldn't solve this case. I remember a year ago I watched something similar happen, feeling that this would be the moment of his failure and wanting to see it. When he caught the guy, a middle-aged cubicle jockey who was murdering prostitutes instead of buying a Jaguar like everyone else who has a midlife crisis, I had watched him crow about it in the press conference and tried not to puke. If pride came before a fall, then his fall was a long time coming. I don't know what I'm gonna do, bro. I've been sleeping like shit. I think Carol is starting to suspect that I'm cheating on her. Are you? I asked, ready to put some more arrows in my quiver. No, of course not. I made a note of his quick dismissal, doubting it and saving it for later. But she sees these long hours and jumps to conclusions. I'm out all night pounding the pavement, going over evidence, so I must be out having some kind of affair or sleeping with someone at my office. I can't understand it. I've always taken care of her and the kids. I don't know where all this is coming from. Are you on the job now? Yeah, we're driving to a scene now. I'm hoping like hell it's just a copycat, someone who's a little sloppier than this guy. We tried to keep this out of the news, but when 10 girls get cut up like this, it's almost impossible to keep quiet. I need to catch this guy. My reputation's on the line here. My boss, I could hear him reach up and rub the bridge of his nose, is really coming down on me. We're here. I gotta go. Be safe out there, little brother. There's a lot of crazies out there. I smirked as he hung up, glad to hear he was worried. Maybe this would end his career, let him see how us normal people lived in the muck of disappointment for a while. Hadn't I lived for most of my life like that? Did my parents throw me a party or buy me a car when I finished college? Had they helped me take my state boards or paid for all kinds of test prep that I didn't need and desperately had wanted? Did they constantly talk about my perfect job and perfect family every time they called to see how I was doing? No, they didn't give a shit about me any more than he did. He just wanted a sounding board for his ideas and someone to nod and tell him, "Sure, big bro, you're so right." Maybe it was his turn to be wrong for a change. March 21st. He must be getting desperate. He actually asked me to come and take a look at a crime scene with him. I was just heading to the bar, ready to be regaled on how he could have possibly let this guy kill 13 women and still have no idea who he was, when he called me. He sounded even more frantic this time. The lack of sleep was starting to catch up with him, I could tell, and he sounded like a cornered animal. I didn't let the glee leak into my voice as I listened to him, but I don't see how he couldn't hear it. "Hey, would you mind giving me a second set of eyes?" "Eyes? For what?" "We found number 14 today. This guy, I swear, he doesn't seem to sleep. He just finds these women and kills them without hesitation. I don't know what to do. I'm coming up with nothing. We found more weird bites on this one, and I feel like maybe you should come take a look. I don't know, give me some insight." "Well, I'm no detective. I don't see how I could be of any help." "No, but you work at the mortuary. Maybe you can notice something on the body or notice something on the bites. All my guys are coming up with a blank here, bro. Anything you could tell me would be amazing." I contemplated telling him I was busy, but I thought better of it. Maybe I could help him out. Give him some insight. Wouldn't that just burn him righteously? He picked me up near my apartment, and we rode to the crime scene in silence. My brother kept his eyes forward, but he looked like a smack addict as he snuck glances at me. His hair was unkempt, his ordinarily smooth face covered in coarse stubble, and he shook a little as he drove. I assumed he was past coffee and he'd moved on to caffeine pills as he neared his third week of dealing with these murders. What must Carol think of her husband now that he had completely fallen apart? When we pulled up to the motel, a dingy little place near the interstate, he put a hand on my arm before I got out and looked at me darkly. "I want to thank you for agreeing to this. It's pretty brutal in there. Nothing I'm sure you're not used to, though. I'm up against it, bro. I don't know what to do." And when he said it, he started crying. "I've never had it this hard. This guy, it's like he's playing with me. He's always one step ahead of me, and my investigators, I don't know what I'm going to do if I can't solve this case. The chief is really coming down on me, and if I can't give him answers, I'm going to lose my place as squad leader. I need some help. Do you think you could help me?" I almost couldn't hold my smile. He wanted my help? This was like Christmas and New Year's and losing my virginity rolled all into one. My perfect brother wanted my help. I could just freeze it and eat it. It was so sweet. I agreed, patting his hand and telling him I would do what I could. We moved into the room, and I could see the body hadn't been moved. The room was a mess, blood everywhere, little cards with numbers on them marking organs and cast-off items. The woman's clothes were laying beside the bed, a long hypodermic needle nestled in the bedclothes beside her body. She was splayed out on the bed itself, and her dead eyes looked up at the ceiling. He let me come in, said he'd explain my footprints if it came to it, and gave me gloves just in case. We stood over the bed on opposite sides, my brother looking ready to pop as I assessed the crime scene with my untrained eye. We got a tip-off about an hour ago. Guy called ahead and had the room key waiting at the desk. He sent the girl in to get the key and used a prepaid card so they couldn't track his activity. The card had his transaction on it, and the activity notice was 2 weeks old. He activated it from a burner cell that is currently pinging from a landfill, so we assume he got rid of it. He brought the girl in, shot her full of muscle relaxer, and then he murdered her. No cameras around to see him, no clerk to ID him. No nothing. Left on foot about 2 hours ago, and left the girl in her car here. You sure it was the same guy? I asked. No, but the MO is the same. Organs removed with surgical skill, medical-grade muscle relaxer used to subdue her. No prints found anywhere, and he left her to be found like this. Didn't you say he usually kills them at their homes, though? Yeah, but she was different. Miss Melinda Ka had a husband who was at home at the time of her murder. She brought her lover here so they wouldn't get caught. Boy, did she bet on the wrong guy. I took a look around, under the bed and beside the mattress, before moving into the bathroom. I looked studiously around the motel sink and the long plastic tub. He deposited most of her organs into the sink, writing cheater on the glass in her blood before throwing her heart into the toilet. It was all still as he'd left it. The cops had moved nothing, but it certainly let people know what they were dealing with. After about a half hour of looking, I turned back and shrugged. Sorry, I don't see anything different. Did you, by chance, find out what kind of muscle relaxer the killer was using? No, he must have took it with him. Well, whoever opened her up knows his way around a set of instruments. The cuts aren't sloppy, and the organs were removed with care, but I'm guessing you had figured that out by the 14th body. Yeah, we've been canvassing databases for doctors, surgeons, even veterinarians. So far, nothing. I shrugged again. I don't know. You're the cop, not me. All I can tell you is what I see. It's fine. I'll call you a cab. I really want to stay and have a look at the scene again. Thanks for your help, though. I really appreciate it. He was talking on the phone as I left, calling that cab. As he finished, I heard his phone chirp again, and he answered it. I showed myself out, lingering by the door as a gentle sprinkle of rain began. I could hear him talking to someone through the open door, and it didn't sound work-related. He was telling someone about his hard day, and how the case was killing him, and they must have said something that made him laugh, because his next words seemed a little more upbeat. He told them where he was if they wanted to come visit him at work. I could use a shower like you wouldn't believe. Maybe I'll get a room as far away from this one as possible, and tell my wife I'm working late again. I smirked as the cab rolled up. Seems my hunch about his extramarital affair was correct. Seems my brother wasn't as perfect as everyone thought. April 4th. My brother just called me, but I doubt he'll be here on time. They found another victim, number 20 actually, and my brother was more than a little upset about it. He called me from the scene, and I could hear other cops in the background as he stepped out of the apartment. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice husky. "My apartment. Is something wrong?" He just breathed heavily for a moment as I heard the elevator open and close in the background. "Dee Dee is dead," he said with a little sob as he put his back against the wall in that way he does when news hits him hard. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't think I know who that is." "She was... Look, I'm having a hard time, okay? Carol was icing me out at home. This case is really getting to me, and Dee Dee was just... She was there for me, okay?" I nodded, setting the box I was carrying onto my coffee table as I went back for another one. "So you were having an affair?" It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said, sounding like I had wrung the omission out of him. "And now this killer you can't catch has caught her. Am I mistaken?" "Yeah, you have no idea how much effort it took to pretend like I didn't know her. I had to stand in that apartment, smelling her perfume, smelling her hot blood, and just... But I think I might have finally caught a lead." "Oh?" I set the box down next to the other one, feigning surprise. "I need you to stay where you are, okay? I want to talk to you about what I may or may not know. I need to talk to you before anyone else talks to you. Can you do that?" I smiled at the phone. "I'll be right here when you get here. Don't worry. I'm always here for you, big brother." He hung up then, and I tossed the phone into a corner somewhere as I arranged the boxes. I wouldn't need it anymore. The noose hung over the table like a surprised voyeur. Beneath it sat boxes of evidence, trinkets I'd taken from my victims, the scalpel I'd used to dissect them, and, of course, the vial of muscle relaxer I'd taken from the scene of the very crime he had asked me to come and have a look at. "I know you'll read this, big brother, So I have to thank you for the tag-along on that one. I'd been absolutely certain that you were calling me to let me know you wanted me to come to the station that day. I had just noticed that the vial was missing. A vial with my name on it and everything. I couldn't believe I had been that sloppy. Your forensics team was sure to have found it, and my little plan would be up in smoke. When you asked me to come along, I honestly thought it was a setup. When you asked me to have a look at the scene and tell you what I thought, I was sure it was a setup. When the vial was still there beside the mattress, hidden in a little notch beside the frame, I could have thanked God if I believed in anything so archaic. It was easy to put it in my pocket and continue looking around, your addled brain too fixated on your own crime scene to see me as more than a mouthpiece for what you already knew. You see, the answer should have been clear from the start. You checked the surgeons, the doctors, the veterinarians. That was a slap in the face, I can tell you. But you never thought to check the people who take fucking organs out of dead bodies every day, you moron. It was easy to stay one step ahead of you. I've been sitting on that bar stool and listening to you detail how you catch criminals for years. I had all my ducks in a row from the first murder. I was one step ahead of you before you even knew I existed. And now I will be your greatest failure. You will never catch me, big brother, because when you find this journal, I'll already be dead. This will leave you with a tricky little dilemma. You could inform your colleagues that I was the murderer this whole time. You could admit that you sat right across from me and fed me case-specific information while being unable to identify a murderer in your own family. You could tell them this, but you know that your reputation will suffer for it, and that it will be very difficult for them to trust you after this little revelation. Or you could cover it up, dispose of all the evidence that I've gathered, and pretend that the murderer just stopped killing. You could technically get the win. No more murderers means no more shame of being unable to solve them. But you would know, wouldn't you? You would know that I had beaten you, that I had won, and you would have to live with that understanding for the rest of your life. Choice is yours, big brother. I'm about to make mine right now. I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me a little. It sounds weird to say that our first date was a drive, but I think it was honestly pretty sweet. I'm a photographer, have been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got an amazing eye for location, and my photos have been featured in not just people's homes, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road with a young woman sitting on the hood. She waved her hands at me, asking if I would stop, and I rolled down my window to see if I could help. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her out. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at changing my oil, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed and ended up hanging out with me the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for 3 or 4 hours, and I was the only person that she knew. So, in between photo shoots, we talked. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair. We sat around and chatted as I took some candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterwards and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say, it wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've considered it our first date for years. We even went back on our first anniversary to put a marker where her car had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but we put a wreath there to commemorate her little coupe. It had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep that wreath up. We stop at it sometimes so we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You put 50 cents in the basket, the booth is never manned, and you head on your way. I have no idea who comes to collect the money. I don't imagine it makes a lot of it, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when he gets put out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It's been a busy week. We just put a down payment on our new house, my wife just started a new job, and I had just finished shooting a big wedding that more than paid for the down payment on the new house. But it left us a little light otherwise. We had cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and I had forgotten to put more change in it afterwards for the toll road. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to go up to the lake where the wedding had been held. The lake was where we had had our own wedding, and we went there often to picnic or swim or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I had managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I had thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the stupid thing, but such things were a little too rebellious for me. "You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "No," she said, looking through her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, it's a little better, but it's not quite 50 cents. Just dig some out of the change cup," she said. I shook the cup at her, reminding that we had recently traded it in. "Oh yeah. Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea suddenly bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I'm sure my car's wheels were going to bog down any minute. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected my tires would spew up earth and stick. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck then. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed and wondered why I hadn't simply done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but also half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass, just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I had been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before going home, and snuggling in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one, it seemed. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she would never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the roads winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving the leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply can't believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John, does something seem off about the trees?" she asked, sounding perplexed. I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on television. They look kind of glossy, recorded even. I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week, and we had been through some pretty stressful times. It was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes back on the road, wanting to be there already. We had driven for about another 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking somebody might be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one, my wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed a little at that. They were getting a little greedy out here, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking raptly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the unusual reds and oranges and greens, but something did look a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as we watched them go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all would be normal again. This was weird, yeah, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it had always been. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to pass the weird technicolor trees and get into the deep woods I knew were coming. We had driven for about another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It just couldn't be. I had been driving these roads for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We had passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. What the hell? My wife asked. And when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I meant to. Maybe, she started, pausing a little as she looked nervously at me. Maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I had been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with just one toll booth, so they had to have two more. This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator. I'd write the freaking president about this. They couldn't just, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people out so they could, John! I stopped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" at my wife as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I had yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage, but she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves and pointing with a shaky finger. Look, she stuttered, and I turned to see what she was babbling about. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were also melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin-art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine, and tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I possibly could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it! Stop! Don't do that!" The engine growled as I nudged it up to 80. "John!" my wife screamed, but it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm and laughed maniacally as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made a lot of mistakes that day, but damaging the booth, that was the worst one. My wife screeched when I hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her and immediately felt sorry for what I had done. My foot came off the ignition and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the two-lane road. I had damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it would be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the accident, but finally I just decided to keep going so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized my wife had been silent the whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for going a little nuts back there, but she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside as it rolled by. "Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. Sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so... The trees are wrong, John. Her voice sounded on the edge of hysteria. "What?" I asked, craning my neck around. "They're all dead. They're all dead, John." I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about, but when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it had looked the first time we'd seen the toll booth. I put my foot down on the ignition and we kept rolling forward towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter that ramshackled booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help much either. The sky became darker and darker as we went. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated they became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car, seen a deer, seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept sneaking glances at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay, but I was feeling on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. "Honey," I whispered, not sure how long it had been since we'd spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against this idea. We were just a little lost on a road we had driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we would come out of it okay. "We shouldn't have driven around it." "What?" I asked, confused by her answer. "We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth." She turned towards me and she looked afraid. "We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road." "That's nonsense," I said, but it lacked conviction. I had been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I had never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines that I'd come to love. The trees I could see from the headlights looked more like maples, with a thick dark sap running out of them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking at me nonetheless, challenging me to meet their eyes. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue the fact that we seemed to be stuck, and it had all started after we drove around the toll booth. "Quick, dig under the seat and see if you can find 15 cents. She looked at me in disbelief. "What? 15 cents? That way, if we see the toll booth again, we can pay the toll and get out of here," I nearly growled at her. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the further we drove, the more I also believed that we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, the bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running through the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. I think I see a quarter in the track of the seat, but I can't get it. Can you pull over so I can reach it?" I gritted my teeth, but a quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my lights still glaring into the woods, and told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but it kept slipping through her fingers. I told her to be quick, and when I looked back at the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat with black ridges of overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflected off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creature's. "I've almost got it," she growled through gritted teeth. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned menacingly towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but at that moment it wouldn't have mattered if she'd been a giant. I pulled her back into the car and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as I could, the door bumping shut as we got back on the road. If I had hesitated even a moment longer, we'd likely be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The chest of the creature would have caved the front of my car in, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed as I flew down the road at 70, the other creatures in hot pursuit. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see the pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their chitinous faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead anyway. Seemed like either way, our options were pretty limited. They followed us for a long while, too long for creatures their size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if I'd been going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just. I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to force me off. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful strike. After some indiscriminate amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come up into view, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin on those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money into the basket, whispering sorry as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and into the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it, but I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place we had been in. It was like passing under the coldest waterfall I could imagine. We got home without incident, but it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seemed that even though we had left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car's still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been done less than a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in the cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed the toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules. There's a legend in my town that has always stuck with me, and it's something we grow up hearing since we're very small. Tommy Cold Toes is as much a part of our lives as things like Soap Sally and the Wampus Cat. It's a story that our parents used to scare us into behaving. It's always the same thing, said in those tones of knowledge that make you believe it's true. Better get to bed on time, or Tommy Cold Toes might decide to crawl into your bed. You better not get up to mischief, or Tommy Cold Toes will find his way into your bed. Don't you dare lie to your mother, or Tommy Cold Toes will let her know. The story it comes from is even more chilling than the thought of a ghost in your bed. It's a story about how even a town with less than 1,000 people can host a murderer. Our town was founded in 1789 by a handful of settlers. By 1819, they had either befriended or conquered the Indians that lived in the area, and their daily struggles were mostly personal. The town had around 300 residents, give or take, and one winter they had a problem with a lake in the area. Mather's Lake was a common place to find picnickers or fishermen, but this winter it became the dumping ground for a serial killer. The accounts say that the sheriff was called to the lake one morning at first light to assess a body. A fisherman by the name of Jeremy Gooding had come before dawn to cut a hole for some ice fishing. As the sun rose, however, he felt like someone was watching him. When he looked down to find a body looking up at him through the ice, he said he nearly had a heart attack. The man had gone in his wagon and driven back to town to get the sheriff, and the sheriff had brought a few men with him with saws to break through the ice. With the help of the fishermen, they had pulled out the body of Gilbert Campbell. Gilbert was a farmer from the area and a notorious sot. He wasn't a very good farmer, and it was well known that he had too many mouths to feed and not enough money to afford his drinking and his children. The general consensus was that he'd been walking across the ice on his way home from town and had fallen through and drowned. He couldn't swim, this was widely known, and he was likely too drunk to properly flounder to the surface. His wife and children mourned him, but it was all chalked up to an accident, and life went on. When Gooding went to the same lake 2 weeks later and found 2 more bodies floating beneath the crust of ice, it was harder to push it off as an accident. The victims, Delbert Moore and Winston Fergan, were from the town, though Delbert was a day laborer and Winston was a blacksmith's apprentice. While Gilbert's route home would have taken him across the lake, there was no reason why either of these men should have been in the area. Delbert worked for a farm on the other side of town, and Winston lived above the blacksmith. The sheriff refused to entertain the idea that these could be anything but accidents, but when the 4th body came out of the lake, he had to admit that they might have a problem. The 4th was Harvey McMillan, the son of Drake McMillan, who owned the local bank, and Drake was mad to catch the man who had killed his son. As Mr. McMillan leaned on the sheriff to get results, the sheriff began to apply more pressure to people of interest. There were patrols set up around the lake, and the other local fishing holes were checked for signs of bodies. That was when they discovered 4 more bodies, all farmhands or laborers, and a pattern began to become apparent. All of them were immigrants, except for Harvey. Harvey was born in town, but he'd taken his accent from his father, and the sheriff supposed that's why he had been targeted. It appeared they had a problem on their hands, and it was a problem that the sheriff was very interested in solving. The local sheriff was supposed to keep the peace, and if he couldn't protect the people from whoever was dropping them into the frozen lakes, then they would find someone who could. The town had instituted a watch, keeping citizens on the street to a minimum after dark. They had to assume that these deaths were the result of people being coerced away after dark, and if they could limit the killer's potential victims, then they could catch him in the act. They suspected Jeremy Gooding for a time, but the boy's alibi was strong. There was a rumor going around that a strange woman might be responsible, luring men away from the tavern so she could hide her crimes beneath the ice. They picked up a few women who frequented the local watering holes, but they were released in short order. For a time, the town lived in fear of who would be the next body pulled out of the icy lake. Then, just as December began, they found the body of Thomas Graves. Thomas, Tommy to his friends, was new in town, but well known by those who frequented the tavern. He was a laborer, but his exploits were known to lie at the bottom of a tankard. Tommy could drink any man in town under the table, and his thirst was as prodigious as he was. What's more, he wasn't prone to anger or the hooligan behaviors of his peers. He was a sociable drunk, a cheery sot, and everyone knew that he could drink a keg and still be awake to do the milking at first light. So when the sheriff was called to Carter's Pond at dusk to collect him, it was considered a shame by all. He had sent a pair of constables out to collect him in a wagon, and as they pulled him from the lake, they say his skin was as blue as the ice atop it. They checked his pulse and found him stone cold dead, so they loaded him into a wagon and took him into town. This was December, so the snow was deep and the road was pitted. They had a sheet over him as he lay in his funeral wagon, and the men shivered as they rode with only the moon to keep them company. Both were in some hurry to be done with this task, so they could get to the tavern themselves before heading home to their wives. The grim task would be easier to sleep on after a drink was inside them, and neither were paying as much attention to the body in the back as they should have. The body bounced like a stone as they rode, and neither of them could have said when that bouncing stopped. When they arrived in the town and pulled the sheet away, they found the back of the wagon empty. They had lost the body somewhere along the way, and when they told the sheriff, he was livid. He told them the town already believed that they were making a botch of this, and made them go back the way they had come to look for it. It should be easy to find, he told them. It's a frozen body lying by the side of the road. The two men set out to backtrack their route, but no matter how much they looked or how far they went, they couldn't find the frozen body. They found no sign either. There was no indent in the snow, no sign of scavengers taking something away, and they were left to wonder where it had gone. They searched till morning, spending a night in the cold as they looked for their missing victim. They were still searching when the sun came up, and when they heard hoofbeats approaching, they were hoping it was others who would help them look. Instead, the sheriff came riding up with another man in tow to collect them. The body had been found, and it was in the last place they would have expected. Judge Henry Margus, a judge for the county seat, had awoken to find the body of Thomas Graves in his bed. His servants had heard him screaming and come to check on him, finding him in the corner as he shook and pointed at the bed that he had evacuated. They said that he had been gibbering about rolling over and feeling the cold feet of the dead man against his leg, and wouldn't say much else. He had been shaking as his butler took him off to the sitting room. That same butler, the man who had come out with the sheriff, had secured the bedroom so that they might have a look and come to fetch him immediately. He and his men took statements from the staff and the very shaken judge, but it was ultimately nothing but a strange bit of gossip for the women around the well that day. They took the body to the station so the family could come collect it, and that was when it disappeared a second time. The sheriff, who had reprimanded the two deputies soundly for losing the body in the first place, was perplexed how Thomas Graves had disappeared a second time. He was less perplexed when the judge's footman arrived in the morning to say that Thomas Graves had appeared in his master's bed again. The sheriff arrived to find the man shaken, unable to even speak, but he stuttered about the cold toes of the dead man that had pressed against him as he slept. They took the body away and decided it might be time to bury Tommy Graves so he would stop haunting the judge's house. He would have no idea how fitting a statement that would turn out to be. They buried Thomas Graves in a pauper's grave in the churchyard and thought that they had seen the end of him. They had considered leaving him in the crypt in case his family decided to come for him, but the sheriff was becoming tired of whoever was using Thomas to bedevil the judge. The man hadn't been to court in days, and it was said that the incident had rattled him. The sheriff watched as the undertaker and his apprentice buried Thomas Graves 8 feet in the ground, and hoped that this would be the end of the trouble. It hadn't gone unnoticed that there hadn't been another body found since they had pulled him from the ice, and some of the townspeople were whispering that Graves might have been the killer. Now his body was haunting the judge after death, and somehow that seemed to make it more believable that he was the one putting people in the ice. They had begged the sheriff to put a cage over top his grave, maybe even burn the body, but the sheriff was steadfast in his conviction that Tommy be buried. No servant came on the third day. On the third cold morning after Thomas had come out of the ice, the judge came bursting into the station to confess to murder. He confessed to the murders of all those pulled from the ice, including Tommy Graves. The sheriff's hunch had been right, it seemed, and he confessed to killing all of them because they were immigrants. He had never liked foreigners and assumed that no one would notice if a few of them went missing. He had assumed that someone would catch him after killing Harvey McMillan, but when he had walked away scot-free, he felt invincible. That was before, though. Now he was being hounded by the vengeful Thomas Graves and wanted the sheriff to protect him. I would have never killed him if I had known he would haunt me so. The sheriff knew they would find Tommy in the man's bed again, and that's just where he was when they went to collect him. It seemed, however, that Tommy wasn't content to stay put. They never found him in the judge's house again, but there were plenty of people who claimed to have seen him after that. Usually it was a shadowy figure walking along the road to town, the same route the wagon had taken when he had disappeared. Others say they've seen him near the lake, where he died, walking along the shore and watching the water. Others, however, claim that those with secrets, those with guilt, feel the press of cold toes against their leg in the night and know it's time to confess. I've never felt them, but I know people who claim they have, and that's as good as a confession around here. Whatever the reason, Tommy Cold Toes has become a story told from Halloween till Christmas in these parts. So if you roll over in the middle of the night and feel the cold press of toes against your leg, don't worry. It's just Tommy Cold Toes trying to get warm. "Daddy, I lost a tooth." He lisped a bit as he said it, and as I held my hand out, I saw that he had, indeed, lost a tooth. It was one of the front ones, and I congratulated him on losing it so cleanly. I wondered if he had pulled it out himself, but I put that out of my mind. Brandon didn't even pull his own splinters out, and I really couldn't see him yanking out his own teeth. He was 6 and 1 month, as he liked to say, and this was the first tooth that he had lost. He was late in that respect. Many of his friends had already started losing baby teeth, but he was giddy as he brought this one to me. "Now, the tooth fairy will come and take it away," he said, skipping off to continue playing. Ah, yes, I'd forgotten about that part. Brandon had become obsessed with the tooth fairy after his friend Nina had lost her tooth. He thought of her like the blue fairy from the Pinocchio story, and he was very excited that she would come through his window and leave money for his teeth. He had asked what she did with all those teeth, where she got all the money, and 1,000 other things. I was a pretty creative person, and I'd come up with all kinds of stories about what she did with them, where she got the money, and how she came in without making a sound. On and on and on. I was kind of glad that he had finally lost a tooth, because I was starting to run out of material and thought if he experienced it, he might lose interest in it. We put it under his pillow that night, and I assured him that it would be gone in the morning and there would be money when he got up. Then, of course, I fell asleep waiting for my wife to get home and woke up to find her sleeping beside me and the sun already peeking over the horizon. I went quickly but quietly and thanked my lucky stars that Brandon was a sound sleeper. He hadn't woken up yet, and I took the $1 I was going to put under his pillow out of my pocket and prepared to make the swap. To my surprise, however, the tooth was already gone. No one had left money, but the tooth had disappeared. I looked around, thinking it had slipped out, but it was just gone. I left the $1 anyway, not wanting him to be disappointed, and went back to my room to get more shut-eye before the alarm went off. We never made it to the alarm because Brandon came in waving the $1 and saying that the tooth fairy had come. Look what the tooth fairy left me. He said it was all for me. I told him that was awesome, but internally I raised an eyebrow. He? The tooth fairy had always been a woman anytime he'd talked about her before. Maybe, I thought, Brandon had just had a dream or something that night. He put the money in his piggy bank, and I figured we could maybe put the thing behind us. 2 days later, as I put him to bed, I put my hand beneath his pillow and felt something strange. I took my hand out and found another tooth. "What's this?" I asked. "Oh, I lost another tooth," Brandon said. No excitement, no hope that the tooth fairy would come, just a matter-of-fact tone. I guess that was what I wanted. His obsession with the tooth fairy had ended when he finally lost a tooth. He'd gone from being absolutely excited to absolutely unfazed, and that stopped me for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me you had another loose tooth, buddy?" I don't know. It just kind of happened." I put the tooth back under his pillow, telling him to make sure to say something next time, and then I kissed him goodnight and put him to bed. When I went to put the money under his pillow a little later, though, the tooth wasn't there. Instead, there was a coin. I took a look at it, thinking it was a $50, but realized I was wrong almost at once. At first, I thought it was one of those weird chocolate coins you sometimes got for Christmas. Turning it, I realized it was just extremely grubby. It was heavy, like it was made out of brass or copper, and the surface looked dirty, like it had been at the bottom of a well for quite some time. I started to take it with me, something in me wanting to keep it away from my son, but I put it back instead. It wasn't mine after all, and by the look of it, it was probably something that he treasured. It had been back under his pillow for less than a second before his hand went searching for it. His fingers took hold of it almost greedily as he clutched it, and I decided to take the dollar back with me. Brandon changed a bit after that night, but it's only in retrospect that I see it. He became very secretive, not my little buddy like he used to be. Brandon didn't want to play video games in the living room with me anymore. He didn't want to read stories at bedtime either. He spent a lot of time in his room and seemed to be closing off. His mother laughed at me when I told her that my feelings were a little bit hurt by it. "He's just being a kid. Kids go through phases sometimes. Don't take it so personally. A couple of months from now, he'll probably be back to his usual self again." I hoped he would, but it was hard to ignore the physical changes that were going on in him as well. Not only was Brandon quieter, but it seemed like he had grown. He hadn't gained a foot in a single week, but sometimes it seemed like his fingers were abnormally long, his arms strangely jointed, and his face was oddly stretched. He would look at me sometimes, look at me like he was thinking about doing something that he knew would make me angry. I didn't like it, but he never did it right out in the open. Like I said, Brandon never came to sit with me or play video games, but I would sometimes catch him peeking at me from the hallway or from under the table in the kitchen. It was creepy, but I figured it was just little kid behavior. A month after Brandon lost his first tooth, I found another one in his backpack. Well, no, not just one. I found 5 hidden in the front pocket of his backpack after he left it on the kitchen table when he went to go to the bathroom. He had become pretty protective of that backpack, putting it in his room or keeping it close by at all times, and I started getting suspicious of what might be in there. I didn't think it was drugs or anything. He was 6, but I thought it might be something weird or dangerous. What if he had a snake or something in there? So when he suddenly ran off to go to the bathroom, I knew this was my chance to have a look. I needed to sign his folder for school anyway, so I took out the folder and looked over the day's report before taking a peek in the pockets. The teeth were just sitting there, bumping together when I poked at them, but they didn't really look like human teeth. They looked more like animal teeth, and they were too strange to have come out of my son's mouth. They might have been from a cat or a dog, I suppose. Maybe a "What are you doing?" I zipped the backpack and turned around, looking like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. Nothing, just signing your folder. Brandon looked at me with a great deal of mistrust, taking the backpack and going to his room without putting his back to me. I told his mother about the teeth when she came back from work, but she brushed it off again, saying that little kids often collected strange things. My brothers collected animal skeletons they found in the woods, she said dismissively, as we got ready for bed. Thank goodness it's just teeth and not a whole skull. I let it go, but it was hard not to see what was going on. Brandon started looking like he wasn't sleeping well. He had huge bags under his eyes, and he was fidgety anytime he was made to sit still, like at dinner or for homework. He would get short and agitated, muttering to himself in a way I couldn't understand. I listened carefully once when he was doing math homework, and it sounded like he was talking in a different language. He looked up when he saw me noticing, squinting at me with that look of distrust, and it broke my heart to see him like that. Brandon had always been my little buddy, and this sudden change in him was painful to watch. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the school. They needed to speak with me about something important. Brandon, it seemed, had been in a fight where he had knocked more than a few of the kids' teeth out. I came down right away, afraid that Brandon had been hurt, but when I saw him sitting in the principal's office, he looked none the worse for wear. He had a bruise on his cheek, and his hands looked like he had beat them against a wall, but he didn't seem injured or in distress at all. Quite the contrary, Brandon looked happier than I had ever seen him. I took a seat next to him in the office, waiting to see what they thought was so important. We called you in, not because Brandon has been fighting, but because of other rumors going around his class. Rumors? I asked. Yes, sir. The student he fought with said Brandon had been making strange deals with other students. I shook my head, not quite understanding. What kinds of deals? They say he's been buying people's teeth. I shuddered, thinking about the teeth in the bag I'd saw not too long ago. I looked down at Brandon, questioning him with my eyes as to whether it was true. He looked back at me without hesitation, pretty much letting me know that it was. He's been trading his lunch for them. He's been trading other things for them too, toys and small things. He's allegedly traded over 20 students for their teeth across 3 grades. Today, the student in question had taken the trade but refused to give him any teeth. Your son responded by beating the teeth out of his mouth. I looked down at Brandon, asking what he was thinking. He didn't bother to answer, just clenched his fists in his lap and looked at the floor. I think that was when it really hit me how much he had changed. The bags under his eyes were dark and deep, and his fingers were long enough that I couldn't see how anyone didn't notice. Each finger seemed twice as long as it should be, and as he clenched, I could see a 4th knuckle on each of them. The reason we called you in, sir, is, well, to get those teeth back. I turned and looked at the principal. What do you mean? He looked a little green as he wiped his forehead with a napkin. We believe your son has the missing teeth, but he won't tell us where they are, and he won't give them back to us. We can't seem to find them, and the mother is hopeful that the dentist can put them back in if they're not too badly damaged. If anything else, they want them back so they can take them to the dentist and make sure they're baby teeth and not permanent. Brandon hasn't said a word about where he put them, and we are deeply troubled by this behavior. I looked at Brandon and asked him where the teeth were. He shook his head, not saying a word. I asked him again, and when he shook his head this time, I heard something. Something nearly indistinguishable, but altogether unsettling. Something was rattling in his mouth. We can sit here until you decide to give us the teeth, but you're not leaving until we get them back. I don't know what's gotten into you, I said, but the idea that we wouldn't be leaving seemed to decide him. He bent slowly over the principal's desk, making eye contact with the older man the whole time as he opened his mouth. 3 teeth fell out as he pushed his tongue out, and none of them appeared to be his. The teeth clattered on the desk like old dice, and more than one of them had a root hanging from them. As he sat back up, I had the sneaking suspicion that he was holding out. The principal, however, seemed more than okay with what he had gotten back. He told us to go, saying that Brandon was suspended for 2 weeks, and I collected up my son as we headed for the door. The principal managed not to vomit before we got out of his office, but it was a near thing. We talked the entire way home. Well, I talked. Brandon just sat there and said nothing. I told him I didn't know what this was about, but that he needed to stop. This wasn't him. This wasn't like him, and he needed to tell me what was going on so I could help. I was his dad. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't help him if he didn't talk to me. The whole time, he just sat there and stared at me. Most kids who are being chastised look out the window or look at their feet, but he stared directly at me in brazen defiance. His fingers kept flexing, and I saw him put a hand to his pocket more than once. I wanted to tell him to turn them out, to give me the tooth from that kid that he had kept, but something in me didn't quite dare. I was loath to admit it, but I was a little bit afraid of my son in that moment. He looked nothing like the boy that I had known for almost 7 years. My grandma used to tell me stories about babies taken by fairies and the changelings they left behind. This reminded me of those stories. The kid in front of me was so fundamentally different from the one I knew that it was almost like talking to a different person. As we pulled up in the yard, I told him he was grounded. No tablet, no TV, no dessert. But Brandon didn't seem to care. He just walked inside and went to his room. His tablet was still on the charger, and his TV remote was left hanging off the door to his room. I didn't know what he was doing in there, but it clearly wasn't playing. He was way too quiet, and when his mother called to tell me that she was working a double, I almost cried. I didn't want to be alone with him for longer than I had to be, and that made me feel even worse. He didn't come out for dinner, and when I went to bring him a plate a little while later, I heard muffled voices as he spoke to someone. I tried to get the teeth, but they caught me. I didn't know who he was talking to. Kinda thought he might be talking to himself, but when a gruff voice responded, I felt my stomach drop. "You'll just have to do better next time." The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was deep and watery, like something from the bottom of a well, and it spoke in a way that made its mouth sound strangely full. It was devoid of any sort of kindness or charity, the sounds you sometimes hear when people speak to children. It was an authoritative voice, a teacher, and they were not pleased with my son. "I'm grounded. They suspended me from school. I'm not going to be able to get you any teeth for at least 2 weeks. "Your father has teeth," it said matter-of-factly. "Your mother has teeth too." When he answered, he didn't sound afraid. When he answered, it was with cold assuredness. "They won't just give them to me. They don't understand what I'm doing." What was he doing? That's what I wanted to know. I gripped the doorknob, hoping they wouldn't hear me, and that was when the voice said something that made my blood run cold. "Then do not ask them. Take them, like you did from the boy today." I opened the door in one fluid motion, and my son looked up guiltily as I walked into the room. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. "No one," he said, much too quickly. "I heard someone," I said. "I heard someone in here talking to you, and I want to know who it was and where they went." That was a lie. I didn't think I wanted to know who they were. What I wanted was for them to never come back. The person had sounded like some kind of demonic fairy from a kid's story, and I was afraid of what I would see if he did come back. "It's nothing," Brandon said quickly. Too quickly. I was doing voices. I talked to him for a little while longer, but I got nothing. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't tell me anything, and eventually, I just left. I should have left it at that. I should have just left it alone. But I had to try one more time. It was late, about 10:30, which is pretty late for us, and I decided to try a peace offering. I felt pretty certain he was still awake. I had heard something moving around in there, so I cut some of the pie I had made to go with dinner and walked to his room. I was going to offer him the pie and see if maybe we could talk. I just wanted to know what it was that had made him change so much. Most of all, I just wanted my son back. It killed me to have him act like this, but as the door came open, I got more answers than I had bargained for. It was standing over his bed, its arm going under his pillow, and in the darkness of his room, I realized it had to be what he'd been talking to. The pie fell to the ground, but I had a death grip on the plate. I realized later I had sprained my thumb once I was in any state to feel anything. I didn't speak. I could barely breathe, and as the thing turned to look at me, I realized my fairy theory might not be too far off. It was grubby looking, like something that's been living in a ditch. Its features were completely covered in something dark that had the texture of earth, except for the two large lamp-like eyes that protruded from its face like bubble lights. It was tall, something I realized as it took its full height. It had been crouched before, putting something under my son's pillow, and it had to stoop so as not to bang its head on the ceiling, which was about 9 feet from the floor. From its back, 4 insectile wings protruded. They weren't large enough to carry it, but they were large enough to be noticeable. Its hands and arms, the fingers multi-jointed, were far from delicate looking as it wiggled them ceaselessly. I expected it to charge me. I expected it to attack me, but instead, it raised one huge finger to its face and made a shushing sound. "Shh. You'll wake the baby," it whispered, and its mouth sounded like it was trying to swallow something. Then it smiled, and I saw not a double, but a triple row of teeth inside its mouth. There's no order to them. Molars next to canines, next to bicuspids, next to what appear to be fangs and shark teeth. Its mouth is such a mishmash of teeth, it's impossible not to feel a little woozy when you look at it. It pulled its lips down, somehow containing all those teeth, and before my eyes, it vanished. My son was pretty upset when I grabbed him and carried him out of the house. I put him in the car and we waited till his mother got off work before taking him to a nearby motel. I told her what I'd seen as best I could, and I think she believed there might be something going on now. My son is furious, saying that he needs to get back home so he can do his job, but he won't say what that is. Honestly, I think he's been collecting teeth for whatever that thing was. When I went back inside to get some clothes and check the house, I looked under his pillow and found another one of those strange coins. There's a box under his bed, too, and inside it's equal parts teeth and coins. There are around 20 of them, and they're sitting next to teeth of every shape and every size. Most of them are animal teeth, but some of them are definitely human teeth. I've taken the entire box with me, but the phone call I got from my wife before I left the house was what really worried me. She called to tell me that our son had locked himself in the bathroom, and she was afraid he was hurting himself. There's a weird squelching noise, followed by him yelling and crying. He'd locked himself in the bathroom, but I went to the manager to unlock it for us. What we found in there will stick with me for a long time. We're at the hospital now. My wife is in the ER room with him, while I sit in the waiting room and wait for updates. Protocol states only one parent can go in at a time, and my son doesn't want me to go in there. He can't speak very well, but he made that very clear to my wife. I gave him space, not wanting to exacerbate his condition any more than I have to. I've got the box on my lap as I sit out here, and I'm not really sure what to do with it. Inside are the 8 teeth that he managed to pull out of his own head before we got him restrained. Whatever this creature is, it must get its due, and my son is apparently intent on giving it that due. We'll probably end up having to take him to a mental facility, but I know he isn't crazy. I saw that thing too, and I know it'll find him no matter where we take him. So be careful when you tell your kids about the tooth fairy. What comes to collect their teeth might be something far worse than even you can imagine. Driving a train sounds pretty exciting, right? It's really not. When you're taking your licensing course, you get a sense of excitement. You feel like you're part of a long legacy of train conductors. You imagine yourself dodging train robbers or having to solve a murder mystery, meeting guests for drinks in the dining car, or riding the trails to California or Texas. Well, in reality, you're mostly hauling cargo. Like many others, I found myself hauling freight cars through the dark of night. At this point in time, most things on the train come down to pushing buttons and trying not to hit people or things on the tracks. Run the horn every time you come within 100 feet of a crossing, make sure the tracks are in good shape, note any damage or signal malfunctions in your logbook, get to your destination and drop off your cargo. Rinse, repeat. I do the 6P to 6A run. Most of my route is done completely in the dark. The train rolls on while I sit at the controls, and Roger would take over every few hours so I can stand out on the platform and have a smoke or eat something out of the fridge we keep in the back. We don't haul passengers. Well, cattle sometimes, so there's no dining cars or sleeper cars or people besides Roger to talk to. After tonight, I guess I won't even have Roger. I'm pretty new at this, Roger having only worked here a few months longer than I had, and neither of us had any idea about Track 54. All the tracks have mile markers, and between track mile 53 and 55 is, well, you guessed it, Track 54. It runs through a deep stretch of woods, and the track is the only thing that's not trees or dirt for about 20 miles. It's a lonely stretch, and it gets a little creepy out there sometimes. Roger says it's bullshit, but I could swear you can see things in the woods watching the train as it goes by. The good thing about the woods is that they're only 10 miles from the depot we use to drop off cargo. So, once you're there, you're almost half done with your shift. Tonight was a little different. I was sitting in the passenger seat, browsing Reddit on my phone, when I heard Roger swear and cut the brakes on sharply. I braced and looked out the glass, sucking in my breath when I realized why he had stopped. It's not uncommon to get stuff on the tracks, trees or animals sometimes, but this was definitely something we needed to call in. There was a body laying on the tracks. Roger keyed up the mic and called it in. "Engine 13 here on track 54.5, he said, looking at the screen, reporting a body on the tracks. The line went dead for a few seconds before someone came back from dispatch. "Engine 13, come back. Did you say a body on the tracks?" 10-4, human body on the tracks, said Roger. More static before someone came back over. A different someone than the young woman who had answered us. Is it living or is it dead? Roger squinted at it for a moment. Does it matter? There's a body on the tracks. It's the difference between calling the police and calling an ambulance, so yes, it matters. Roger sighed, glancing left and right at the woods before handing me the radio. Keep these numbnuts updated while I go check what kind of body this is. Then he climbed out of the train and moved to the front of the cab. I could hear him calling the person on the tracks and getting no response. The body appeared to be sleeping there, arms and legs splayed out over the ballasts, but I couldn't tell if they were breathing or not from the cab. Roger didn't seem to want to leave the side of the train and investigate, probably wondering if this were a robbery of some kind. It's not as common as you'd think for people to block the tracks and rob a train. Our cargo is mostly cement powder or cinder blocks, maybe some quarried stone or various other things like AC units or unrefined oil. It's not really something a train robber would get away with easily. The handpiece crackled back to life as the older voice asked if we were still there. I told him we were, and that's when he asked for our location again. The way he asked made me feel a little anxious. He sounded relieved that I had answered, but sounded hesitant to have my location. Track 54.5, I told him, eyes still on Roger as he walked closer to the body. Silence for a good 10 seconds followed. I watched Roger creep towards the man, almost comically. My eyes cut to the woods for a half second, thinking I had seen movement in the trees. Was it an optical illusion? The only light was the big headlight, and it made things in the peripherals look weird sometimes. Roger was nearing the tracks when the mic cut back on and made me jump. "Drive over it." I stared at the handpiece in surprise. "What?" "Drive over it. Get the hell out of there. No one's supposed to leave the cabin after track 50. Did no one tell you that?" I looked back up to Roger, who was poking the body with his foot, before turning back towards the train. "No, I've only been a driver for a few months. Roger and I..." But as I watched Roger coming back, I saw something long and white come galloping out of the woods and snatch him up. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It looked like a collection of white pipe cleaners formed into some kind of weird animal and left in a backpack for a few days. It snapped up Roger in its mouth and was over the tracks and into the woods on the other side before I could get a good look at it. Roger was there 1 minute and then gone the next. Engine 13, respond." "Something got Roger," I yelled into the mic. He went out to check the body and..." "Get that train in motion, now," yelled the man on the other end of the radio. I pushed the button, threw some levers, and the train started moving again. I heard the wheels tear through the body on the tracks, a wet and meaty sound, and soon I had it back up to 45 miles an hour again. I felt my breath coming out in hitching gasps as the forest careened around me, but the creature never made another appearance. I could still see that thing as it cantered across the tracks. I could still see Roger's face creased in terror as it grabbed him and took him off into the woods. I suddenly doubted they would ever find Roger, ever find the body I had chopped up beneath my wheels, and I knew there would be no sign of the creature at all. When I pulled into the depot an hour later, there were people waiting for me. People in suits from the Department of Transportation. They told me I had done the right thing. They told me I had been very brave and had saved my company millions of dollars in assets. They made me sign a lot of things and told me to take some time off before coming back to work, if I still wanted to work, that was. They advised that I not talk to anyone about what had happened and made me sign some papers saying that I wouldn't. Well, guess I screwed that up, didn't I? It's been a week and I still see that thing when I close my eyes. I researched that stretch of track and the woods that surrounded it. There are more than a few strange stories about a creature that lives there. A hiker recently went missing, a man with dark hair and a thick beard who was wearing jeans and a blue t-shirt the last time anyone saw him. A man I would swear I saw laid across the tracks that night when Roger was taken. The line keeps calling to ask if I'm coming back to work. I just don't know if I can ever drive through those woods again. After someone sees this, I may not have to worry about that anymore.